Jason,
Yeah, this is
Jason, before we start, may I ask why you said what is going to be a challenging year? What that makes me,
an election year. It's always a challenging year when we're in an election. So,
oh, just because of that. Okay.
do I need another reason?
No, that's a big reason. I agree, but I thought there was something there locally that you were referring to.
I'm getting ahead of it. I'm redefining, and I will be emphasizing our Christian identity over our political identities throughout this
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
Today we are looking at This is the second part of our series on sacred days. Last week we looked at Palm Sunday, which, if you didn't hear, we'll be doing together communally in on Palm Sunday. We'll be at the Baptist Fellowship Hall as a larger community of faith, and not on Sunday. And then Sundays we'll worship in our individual communities. But during the week of Holy Week, there's a lot of things that happen depending on the community you're in. If you're in Orthodox, if you're in a Roman Catholic tradition, there are so many more things that are going on than if you're oftentimes, and in mainline Protestant stuff, you still have a few more things, all the way down to lots of evangelical or non-denom churches that just haven't followed into the liturgical pattern of the year, and typically they'll celebrate or observe Good Friday and Easter. Today we're talking about Maundy Thursday, and I have just sort of a little snippet on Holy Wednesday, and something that typically is celebrated in some Roman Catholic churches and a lot of Eastern Orthodox churches, and in very few Protestant churches, but it's all a part of the Holy Week. Um, just as an aside, part of the reason we are celebrating, or part of the reason the thought behind celebrating our community's faith celebration or community Easter celebration on Palm Sunday was that it gives us a chance to set the stage to say these are things that are happening throughout the week that we as a larger faith community participate in. And so we're hoping to really in some way boost the participation in things that are off. That if we can send people from Palm Sunday in such a way that they are thinking about it as a experience of as a week. It's meant to be a week that's set aside. It's meant to, in the same way, um, um, Sunday is meant to be a little Easter. Every Sunday is meant to be not just a Sabbath. It's meant to be a celebration. This is why you don't fast on Easter, or I mean on Sundays. Fast throughout the week, and even along in fasting traditions, Sunday comes around and it's meant to be a little Easter every single week. You don't fast on Easter because it's meant to be a season, a day of celebration. So every Sunday is meant to be a celebration. In some churches, every Friday is a remembrance of Good Friday. In fact, in the today community, there's a whole ritual around the cross and having the cross down, and it all focuses on the crucifixion. Now they do that because they have a rotating number of pilgrims coming through, but at the end of the day, they take part in that tradition that seeks to not just celebrate the events of Jesus' life on the season of Lenten season, the Holy Week, but that really every week is a mini journey through Jesus' life, and therefore Good Friday becomes something that you observe every week, so that then you can celebrate fully Easter on Sunday. But Maundy Thursday is something that stands out in most traditions. It is one of in fact, the practices that surround Maundy Thursday probably were even more robust than Palm Sunday, as we talked about last week. Although Palm Sunday was definitely tradition, the observances around both the foot washing and the sacrament of the Eucharist made this holy day more significant, I guess, in some ways, and it mirrors, and we'll talk about that. It mirrors Passover. But what I'd like to do today is we're going to look at just a couple things around Maundy Thursday as a whole. I'm going to point out some stuff that that the other countries do, and how it's celebrated around the country. I do want to talk about Wednesday of Holy Week, and then we're going to look at the Old and the New Testament references, both the Old Testament going back to the Passover, idea of um, um, the establishment of what Passover is goes back to the story in Exodus, and then what we have in the Last Supper is in the heart of the celebration of the Passover, where Jesus, as a Jew, was celebrating what happened in the Exodus and observing what happened in the Exodus from Egypt, and in the book of Exodus, that that event is then transformed for us as Christians into a new ritual. And I don't want to, and we'll make a point to really think about that idea that something that was still is captured in something that is. I want to look at the Jewish rite or the Jewish practice of a Seder meal. I'm sure many of you have been to Seder meals. I want to look at the practice of foot washing because that characterizes this day more than any other day. And then I did, if we have time at the end, in preparation for our own meal of remembrance, I bought last year's, I guess, menu liturgy for the meal, and we'll probably use something similar this year with a few tweaks. But just walk you through why we're doing this in this year. And so, as many of you were at that meal last year. But all right, any questions before we start? Okay. Maundy, Thursday is always the fifth week of Lent, and it's considered a public holiday. It's not in the fifth week of Lent. I don't know why I wrote that down. We are in the fifth week of Lent, but it goes by a number of different names. Most generally, it's probably called. But there are several traditions that call it Maundy Thursday. And Maundy comes from the Latin word mandatum, which means mandate. And it just
Means what?
Mandate. Like
Mandate? You're breaking up a little.
Let me see what network I'm on. Make sure I'm on a good network. It should be. Maybe that's no. I'm on the best connection that we have right now.
Okay.
It's snowing outside. Maybe that's it, Jason.
What's that?
It's snowing outside. Maybe that has something to do with it.
No. Mandate meaning a command. I command you to do something, and the passage in John, it talks about, he says, I command you to do, or I mandate you to do something. So Maundy is from the word mandate. So in plain English, it's Commandment Thursday. But it goes by lots of names. In the Byzantine Empire that still is functioning today, goes by the Great and Holy Thursday. In Scandinavia, it is called Green Thursday. It's thought that it's because they typically go to a vegetarian diet, in some sense, in fasting. In the Syriac Orthodox tradition, it is called the Thursday of Mysteries. In the Coptic Church, it's called Covenant Thursday, in part because the new covenant was given in communion. We say this cup is the new covenant. That is the cup becomes the sign of the new covenant. And just as a reminder, every covenant that God gives us has a sign to it. The Adamic covenant is a sign of grace, and the garden becomes, or the paradise becomes, that sign of dwelling with God. Noahic covenant, you have the rainbow. The Abrahamic covenant, you have circumcision. The Mosaic covenant, you have the tablets. The Davidic covenant, you have the temple. And the new covenant, which is fulfilled in Christ at the meal that we're talking about, the symbol becomes the meal itself, embedded in that cup, the idea of the shed blood. And so that's where the Covenant Thursday comes in, because this is when the new covenant. This Sunday, one of the readings we're going to have is Jeremiah 31:31, which is what I talk about a lot, but that's where this new covenant comes into being, where it's shifting from what it was in Jewish history and Jewish covenantal theology, where there was a arrangement between God and a people. And in Jeremiah 31:31, the promise of Jeremiah is that God will then basically deal with us as individuals. And so it comes down to and will also imbue us with God's Spirit so that we can discern and know God through our own spirits rather than through the communal mediation of the Spirit to a community of faith as a whole. And I think we sometimes forget that. We think about the fact that the Spirit is always with us. We just live in the Spirit. From the moment you're born, the Spirit has been renewed in our world. And so we don't think about the fact that, we often forget about the fact that back then, the history of Israelites, in the history of Israel, there was no Spirit dwelling in every single person, which is why, again, I always harp on the presence of God, where that presence of God was, and the presence of God was in the temple. That's why for Jews, everything, all the worship, all the rituals, everything centers around the idea that God dwells in the temple. It's often also in some traditions in Europe called Shear Thursday, and not like shear sheep, but maybe a little bit in some root of the word, but it means clean or bright. And part of that is because in some traditions, in most traditions or in all traditions, the color of Lent is purple. And in some traditions, on Thursday night, on that Maundy Thursday or Holy Thursday, they shift the colors from purple to and so it's meant to be bright. And really what it means is it's because the arrest of Jesus and the start of the betrayal and sort of taking it as the beginning of Jesus' passion and his leading to his crucifixion, it's considered almost in the sense of from that moment on, the holiness is a part of that of the events that would happen. And those are generally the names. The event, what happens on it, and most of them they're often, and we'll talk about these in more detail, but there's some aspect of washing feet. Washing feet has been a controversial issue over the centuries about whether or not it is sacramental or not. Some traditions celebrate it alongside the baptism in the Eucharist as being a sacrament. The Orthodox Church or the Greek Orthodox Church for example, celebrates it as a sacrament. But even in the Catholic Church, it's not itself considered sacrament, but in most churches, it's considered sacramental, meaning it's been set aside as a practice. But there's been much debate over whether or not it should be elevated in its practice. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The Last Supper or communion or Eucharist is usually something that is celebrated on Thursday of Holy Week in most churches in some way. I mean, in Orthodox churches or in Roman Catholic churches, and they're gathering, they're going to do it regardless, probably. I mean, so it's a part of the rituals, but it would be one of the sort of non-normal days or special days in the life of Reformed tradition. We sort of encourage churches. You know, there's no stipulation of how often you have to celebrate the Eucharist, but we in the Reformed tradition, the Presbyterian Church, say at least you should really be celebrating at least once a month, which is why most Presbyterian churches do it usually the first week of the month. But in Episcopalian churches, they do it weekly. Roman Catholics do it, celebrate the Eucharist every time they gather for Mass. So the frequency in some churches celebrate it quarterly, and some even sometimes have celebrated it once a year. Even in the Catholic Church, you have allowances for that. So during COVID, they only offered the Eucharist once, I think. So it was one of those things that there's always there's practices around it. The event usually, or the day usually, calls to attention the words that Christ said to his disciples from John 13:34, and it says, "I give you a new commandment," and that's a new mandate, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. And this is kind of like a command. You love, and this is really the funny thing is it's not new. Jesus has already said, "What is the greatest commandment? Love you, Lord God, with all your heart, soul, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself." But love your neighbor as yourself is made into a more intimate way, or brought into a more intimate way. And it says, "I give you a new commandment that you love one another as I have loved you." Now, here's the question around the debate. Some of the debate around that is Christ talking to the disciples about loving everybody in the world as he has loved them, which you would probably say yes. But in this instance, textually, Jesus is not saying, "Go out and love everyone as I have loved you." He's turning to those who are at the table at him and whose feet he was washing. And he's saying, "Love one another as I have loved you." And so in some ways, or perhaps I think personally in a more powerful way, this passage is explicitly about the Christian community. And that and not that there's two types of love, but the way you love a stranger, the way you go if you go into some, like Jesus did into a bar and encounter, someone of ill repute according to society, and you love them, your love is going to look different to them as it might to someone within your own faith. And that's not to say that the washing of the feet that Jesus is saying isn't going out. So there's sort of there's two meanings, or there's two ways the church has traditionally taken this passage. Is it an exemplification of how we love others outside of the church and everyone in the whole world, or is it really focused? Was Jesus explicitly speaking to the disciples, like saying, look, if you're going to, and it comes on the tail of James and John discussing who was the greatest, and who was going to sit next to Jesus, and the hierarchy of the chosen ones. And Jesus is saying, I, as your leader, are willing to become the servant to wash your feet. In doing so, I'm loving you, and I'm showing this love for you, and I want you to self-sacrifice one another, really, so that no one is over anyone else. Because the minute we place any one person over another person, we are evaluating, or we are adding value to our earthly existence. And we do this all the time, fame, power, money, status, material belongings, possessions, good looks, all sorts of things, whether you're tall, short, run fast. We place value on certain things in our world that then place over and against one another. And what Jesus is saying is I haven't placed myself over you. I'm here washing your feet. I'm here serving you. You ought to serve one another. And it's a pretty serious call, especially when you think about the division in the church. How are we serving one another? How are we loving one another as Christ has loved us? So the event really centers around that idea of that new covenant. And then also, lastly, the event or the day, often in some traditions, is called Chrismon. They have a Chrismon Mass, more so in the Roman Rite or in some of the Eastern rites. And that is a day of anointing. And so they take oils, and usually it's a day for clergy or religious professionals to renew their vows. And it kind of is an act of preparation, but it's a sense of recognizing that, and there are other types of holy anointing of the day where people come to Mass or the church or services to be anointed. It is, before I get into the meaning of the word, I guess we talked about that, the Maundy mandate. Interestingly enough, this is the whole idea of, or a lot of the ritual in the Roman Catholic Church followed something called the Roman Missal, Missal, not missile, but missal. And it was actually only a rite that men participated in until 2016. But that was actually, I was really kind of shocked at the lateness of that in terms of that. And the other way that people take it in meaning is maund, M-A-U-N-D, means to beg, and of its verb form, and in its noun form version or form, it means a basket that beggars carry. And so, in a lot of European traditions, there are rituals and rites on the day around people giving coins to people, sort of begging and sort of mimicking some of the begging aspects. And then in one, actually, I don't remember what country it was off the top of my head, the kids dressed as witches and went out and gave coins to, or collected coins for something. And so there's a lot, I mean, like anything in culture, I mean, Christmas too, there's a lot of folklore and a lot of cultural traditions that surround it. Before I get into the movement, because it does affect it, the one thing I want to jump back to, which I was going to, is that that Wednesday, which we're not talking about in its larger sense, so the day before Maundy Thursday, is actually also in some traditions celebrated. It's called Spy Wednesday. If anyone want to guess where we're going with that? No, that's the name I like. Yeah, strangely enough, I just went to Denny just so that I could see his expression. I'm like, it's called Holy Wednesday, Good Wednesday, the Great and Holy Wednesday, and it really is. But it signifies and points to. Oh, actually, it's also called. What did I write there? I don't even think what that is. I can't read my own writing. I don't know, something else Wednesday, soot sweeping Wednesday, Black Wednesday, and Wednesday of Shadows. So now, and I put all that together, what do you think this Wednesday, what part of the whole narrative of Jesus do you think it's recalling? Anyone?
And cleansing of the temple?
No, that actually is a good guess, but it depends on the gospel. Remember that John places it much early, and Synoptic Gospels place it when it would be effective of that. But actually, the commandment that we find comes in John. It actually points back to when Jesus was being anointed by Mary, and the oil was placed on his feet, and the disciples said, hey, that's expensive oil. It could have been sold and given to the poor. And Judas basically wanted to keep the money for himself. And Judas was so mad this was such a waste because again, he didn't understand that Jesus was going to die. This was a burial preparation that was meant to happen. But for Judas, he saw this happen, and so then he goes off and he bargains with the Sanhedrin and Spy Wednesday. So throughout Europe, this is where a lot of people often will put black. They'll start and depending on the tradition, they put black stuff over things that starts the darkness of the Holy Week. And so in some traditions, you're seeing on Thursday white going. Others are starting with darkness or a tenebrae service. We do a tenebrae service combined with the 7 last words of Christ on Good Friday as a part of our rituals or part of our traditions here. But tenebrae services are also traditionally done on that Wednesday service. And it's kind of like the idea of so Jesus comes in, and whether he clears his temple or not, but Jesus comes into Jerusalem, and then you have this event of the anointing of the feet. And for some, the viewing of the anointing of the feet is the beginning of all of the beginning. When that nothing prior to that signifies anything bad is happening. Jesus is coming to the temple. He's doing good. He's his popularity is high. You don't hear. And then all of a sudden this happens, and then Judas goes, and you have the Sanhedrin gathering and in scriptures, and then so a tenebrae service is a service of darkness, and it's meant to get darker and darker, and to the point where you just have one light, and it's supposed to be Christ's light. We do that on Friday. We'll talk about that next week on our Good Friday, and I'll get into more tenebrae how that functions in the 7 last words of Christ.
Jason, could you remind me of the sequence? I know it varies from gospel to gospel, but wasn't Judas at the Last Supper?
So yes, he was, interestingly enough, and that's where you get and Judas's betrayal of Jesus when he leaves the Last Supper means he goes and finds the Sanhedrin to bring them back. But the deal was, if that's where the sequencing you're wondering about. The Judas goes from the anointing to find the Sanhedrin to do the 30 pieces of silver, that then lead to the fact that he betrays Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. The gospel events, and I don't remember exactly because I have notes on it, but our sacred meal, the reason the events are broken up through the different gospels. And even as I last year, as I was preparing for our meal, I took all of the gospel accounts and wrote out the narratives in their sequence. And even the gospel accounts don't quite have Judas always leaving at the same time, and some of them have the idea that the words of institution, so this new commandment, came before Judas left. And I don't remember which ones were which. And then another one came that was left that was after. So there is some ambiguity in where these events happened or the order they happened, even within the Gospels. But again, they're written 50 years after Christ, and this comes into the case of, you can say, well, God still led and inspired these passages to be written, but they're not congruent with one another in any way, shape, or form. And mostly, but our liturgy in a few weeks represent the sequence of meals that I think probably were the most clearly happened, and I think. And this, going back to the betrayal, in what we do, you have all the way going up to the words of institution, so communion plus the meal itself, and then the betrayal happening at the end, that Jesus said, "Go, must do." So, but again, it's not as crystal clear as perhaps we would like it. So that's Wednesday. We don't typically do that. We're actually going to look at next Wednesday, or on the Wednesday of Holy Week. We'll gather here for our Bible study, but that will be to look at what actually is happening on Easter, like what are the rituals that we're celebrating there, culminating our sacred days, to prepare us for what will happen here in the services on Easter, essentially. Any questions thus far? Thoughts, interjections, snippy comments? All right. So for going back to Maundy Thursday, what it does is it really, for most churches, is it does initiate the Passion, or the beginning of the Passion, because it's thought to, when the violence breaks out in the garden and the betrayal happens, because really other than the weird things Jesus is saying at a Passover, no one really had any, he comes into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, he's being celebrated, he sends the donkey, he does his Jedi stuff and all this, everyone's excited. And unless if you have within the synoptic gospels, the turning of the tables and the anger that ensues during builds in the Sanhedrin and in the Pharisees and Sadducees, and they come for him. But if you don't have that instance of violence, there's nothing about what's happening in Jesus' life as he enters the temple that makes you think it's bad. And in fact, in many ways, you have this almost image, if you don't, from our perspective, but from their perspective, it would have been like when they broke away to celebrate the Last Supper in the upper room. They would have broken away because probably the crowds were swarming Jesus. I mean, he was at the height of his popularity. And so everyone was exciting and celebrating. So they're stepping away and getting away. And they go up and they have this meal that was a part of the Passover celebration. Up to that point, the disciples really wouldn't have thought, even Jesus washing their feet, it would have been radical, but Jesus was already doing radical things. And even though Jesus had been talking about this idea of him dying, like none of them are fathoming what's about to happen. None of them have any clue. Even when Judas goes off and he says, go do what you want to do, probably the disciples are, and he says, one of you will betray me. They're like flabbergasted. Who would it be? Who could it be? Peter, and Jesus confronts Peter and says, you're going to deny me. I would never deny you. There's nothing about what was about to happen that they expected. So when they go out into that garden and that begins the beginning of the passion, because he's probably been flogged on his way down to prison. And so this is the beginning. And so the idea is the commemoration of this new covenant. And this Passover meal was the last normal thing Jesus was going to do. The last thing he was going to. This was the last time he was sitting with his 12. He knew it. So the things that he said, this is why we put such, such gravity on what happened at that meal, because Jesus, in his knowledge of what would happen to his own life, not even probably sure in his God consciousness what the actual events would occur, but knew this would actually happen, is sitting there and he's prepared. He's holding it together. Kind of like, if all of a sudden your friends don't have any clue you're going to be leaving and departing, and then all of a sudden you're about to go through this horrendous event. And so it's the last normal thing he does, and he commemorates it, and he gives us words, and those words have been studied to the nth degree, and they should be, because they are considered across the board one of the universal sacraments along with baptism, and something that we celebrate regularly. Included in the practices of Maundy Thursday, you have foot washing ceremonies. You definitely have communion. I mentioned the Chrisman Mass. That's the anointing with the holy oils. Oftentimes, churches will strip their altars or their communion tables from the parapet, the colors that are out there. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, I said they go from purple to white. And it's actually one of the days that they allow for the Eastern Orthodox Church, Mass, in the midst of this long season of fasting, they allow them to drink wine. Because the wine is such an important symbol, both for Passover and for the Lord's Supper. For a lot, the vestments and the paraments that go, and the things that hang on the pulpit and on the altar, they go from purple to black. So they will for us for Good Friday. So after the meal from here, probably that night or later that maybe on Good Friday morning, I'll come in and do that. But I put a black cloth over the pulpit and over the. And then basically prepare it for the Tenebrae service that night. But black becomes the color of Good Friday. In some traditions, they quiet the bells. The bells are meant to ring the heralds of people to church. And where I don't even know where I wrote it down somewhere in Sweden. Oh, there it is. In Sweden, actually in Sweden they do it starting on Wednesday, but many will do it on Thursday as well. But in Europe, in Sweden, it's called Menelon's Day, which is the day that they change the metal clapper in their bells to wood. So they still ring them, but it's like a muted, dull, it's just sort of, it's a duller sound. So you have this in some churches, they put black stuff over everything. And many times growing up with kids, I think probably when I was doing a lot more intentional catechesis, things just, we still do it, but we haven't done it. I think it is probably faithfully. But when Judah was young, we used to have a cloth for every lamp in the house. And we wouldn't turn on the lights, and we would actually put little black cloths over everything just to kind of remind us of the beginning of this darkness. So for the disciples, what they experienced was this utter darkness of this is all over, what just happened. And so it's meant to mimic some of these things that are happening, to not necessarily make us experience that which we didn't, but to remind us to be in a place of thoughtful reflection about what actually happened.
Jason, yeah, can I ask a question? About the darkness. When Judas went to the Sanhedrin, what did he tell them that made them come and arrest him? Because were they looking for him?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the actually.
Yeah, I thought they knew where he was.
What's that?
I thought the Sanhedrin already knew where he was.
It is one of the that has been a question about the narrative for some time. Why did Judas have wouldn't they have known? And yet you would think, here's this guy, they would have known. But you got to also consider the fact that there's a lot of people. They were all of similar ethnic background, so they probably all looked very similar. And they all had beards, and they all wore robes, and they all had long hair, and so maybe, and I don't think my impression is that they probably could have located Jesus without Judas. I think what they were paying Judas for, well, obviously was, I think, in part to fulfill prophecy, but that Judas knew where Jesus would be when there would be no other people. Like if they couldn't arrest him in the crowds. So in order to arrest him, he was in the garden. He was with his disciples. He was with 11 folks. It wasn't like there was a large crowd, and so even then there was retaliation. So it was in part to fulfill prophecy, and in part to, I think, just practical convenience. I mean, could the Sanhedrin figured it out and arrested him some other time? Probably. But this is the way God chose to have it unfold.
Judah had been with him so many
Judah.
so many times right there.
Yeah. Right there, and he knew where he'd be, and it's symbolic at that point to some extent. I mean, could you imagine being a disciple and seeing your fellow disciple come up and kiss Jesus? But again, Judas didn't think this was gonna, it wasn't about charges of blasphemy, there was, it was, and I don't remember exactly off the top of my head what the charges were, but he betrayed them because he thought that if Jesus was arrested, that it might give rise to this militant movement. So it was never about death. This is why all of a sudden Judas is like, what the heck's happening? Like, this isn't what we, when he wanted to give the money back, he ends up committing suicide. I mean, like, this is, that's a pretty, we always cast Judas as being the villain, but honestly, I think, man, it's, and even it says, Jesus said this was so the fulfillment of the prophecy could happen. Judas was a pawn or a player within the larger scheme of what was meant to happen in this process of redemption. Why? Those are the mysteries that we will never know, or maybe when we could know, we really don't know. Can you speak out loud just so
I mean, if you think about it wouldn't be out of character to try to make what they make it
No.
Let's just get this thing started. Jesus is gonna,
Yeah.
He's gonna be a hero. He's gonna be Romans going down, whatever. So he can be doing administration, everything. Foster in what I think should.
Judas was manipulating the situation. Well, he's like, everyone loves you. We just came in on, they're throwing their robes and the palms down. Everyone, like, why wouldn't we be taking advantage of this popularity? And so for him, and again, there's nothing unique about, I mean, other than the words that Jesus said, probably when he said those things, even the disciples probably didn't really process what he said. No, not at all. That's why I have compassion for him. I still wouldn't name my kid Judas. So people are like, when I say when people tell people that my son's name is Judas, they'll be like, Judas? I say, who would name their child Judas? Any other thoughts? Questions? Okay. Let's get into, I want to look at the, before we dig into the foot washing, well, actually, yeah, let's do that. we'll do the Old Testament, then I'll look at the Seder meal, and then we'll do the New Testament and the foot washing. So if for those of you who have your Bibles with you, Exodus 11. Look these up with you. It's easier than. Wait a minute, this way. Fill the Bible, even if it's not. Exodus 11, 4 through 10. It says, so this is the beginning of what brings, so in other words, like, why are we celebrating Maundy Thursday? It happened during the Passover. The very event that Jesus was celebrating was because 11, 4 through 10 says, so Moses said, this is what the Lord says, about midnight I will go throughout Egypt, every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne. And I don't need to read it, it kind of goes on, but basically it says, all the firstborn are going to die. And this is why I go back, like I said on Sunday, there are things in Scripture we got to reconcile. We can't say everything's perfect and peachy keen. It's a pretty dark passage. God sends a death that comes down into the earth and takes the life of the firstborn, and not in a discriminate way. And the only thing that protects, if you've ever seen the movie The Ten Commandments, which has stuck with me, have anyone seen those? Charles Heston's Ten Commandments? And they like coming as a black smoke that just sort of goes down. And I think that's probably, I mean, I don't know if that's what it looks like, but but that for me has always been a very profound, visual. But when the blood of the lamb was over, they sacrificed the lamb, and then the blood was placed on the doorposts. And I still remember the scene where they're like pulling people in. Joshua, quick, get in! But you're the firstborn. Get in, get inside, because they almost as if they see the smoke visibly coming to them. And when that smoke touches you, so you don't want to fool around too much. But if Joshua, as the firstborn, had stayed out, despite the fact that he had been Jewish, he would have died as well. And so we have this memory of the 10th plague, and Passover harkens back to this event, and not just the 10th plague, the results of it. And in this, there's a commandment to eat matzah for 7 days, and basically in preparation, they're preparing their lives to depart. And it's meant, and today they celebrate these things to remind them. I mean, this was one of the most, probably one of, if not the most significant series of events in Israel's life. You could say getting a king was important. You could say building the temple was important. You could say prophets, or you could say different periods were important. But when you think about the narrative of Israel, 400 years in slavery, again, that's longer than the history of our country. And 400 years in slavery, of generation after generation, they're finally being liberated. The events that bring them to this event, to the Red Sea, to the wilderness, all these things. This is this event of God liberating them as a people and bringing them over a period of the next 40 years to the Promised Land is a reminder for who they are, that they were brought out of slavery, that they were taken and set aside, they were set apart, they were made holy, they were consecrated. These are the concepts behind the Exodus. So that liberation of slavery is due to the passing over. That Passover, and when Pharaoh had this plague finally hit his son, he just said, I can't deal with this. God is too powerful. Go, just get out. And they leave, and this is what freed them. And the Passover is called Pesh in Hebrew for the Israelites. And the way they celebrate this narrative, or the part of their story, which was for a long time a very oral-oriented story, is most Jews will celebrate a Seder meal. Now, just show of hands, even online, how many of us have been to a Seder meal? Anyone online? You haven't been to one?
Yeah, we've been doing.
So
we have Pat.
So Seder meals are the sort of standard way that Jews will celebrate. They have a week of Passover, and there are events, but the Seder meal is the highlight of that week. I remember, I remember, but they're not always like somber and serious, because I just want to point out when I in seminary, Princeton University had a Jewish group there that did a chocolate Seder, which I don't know how I feel about. I mean, I always wanted to go, but I guess there's, you know, each of the different symbols that are represented on in a Seder meal for Jews are somehow characterized in types of chocolate. So it's, and the bottom line is, there's part of me that says it's catechesis. The reason you do the Seder meal is to remind you who you are as an identity. You know, it's kind of like if we as Americans, we're like, you know, we're going to have this event where we celebrate the revolution, or you know, or this, you know, we kind of do around the Independence Day. We have our rituals, you know, rituals and rites around that. But in a Seder meal, it's meant to remind Jews across the board in a communal way that they have come from this liberation. Typically, Seder meals.
Jason, when do Jews today celebrate the Passover?
Well, it goes again. It's by a lunar calendar. Their events run by the moon, and so it'll fall sometime between March and April. And it does often coincide pretty closely with Easter. Although depending, it doesn't always line up. Last year, I think it was last year that it lined up almost perfectly with the last year or the year before that. The Seder, the night that people do Seder meals in Jewish traditions lined up with the night that people do Seders, the beginning of the Passover, Seders with Maundy Thursday. And they say if it's meant, Passover lasts 7 days, and again, but a lot of them will just, there's their observation, or you know, their fasting. There's rituals as well. But they call, you know, I said it culminates in the Seder meal. But it's funny because I learned that if you're in Israel, you can go to one Seder, but if you aren't in Israel during Passover, then you are expected to go to two. One for, I guess, Jewish identity, and one it's called a diaspora Seder, or you're doing it as being spread out. The whole thing is centered around remembering the Exodus from Egypt. There are songs, there are scriptures, there are readings, there are the 4 questions that the kids ask is very intergenerational. That way, the kids drive some of the teaching. The entire thing around a Seder meal and the way it's come about through the teachings of the Haggadah, which is a liturgy that comes from the Talmud. Jewish rabbis or scholars that came about from 200 to 500 AD, basically put in, and the Talmud is a book of Jewish law and theology, and we often think, well, the Jews get all their stuff from the Bible, or from their scriptures, from their holy books, but actually they get most of their functions for living, the way they live, the way they act, the way they practice their faith, the way they enact rituals, comes from the Talmud. And the writings that sort of, and in this case, the Haggadah, which is a word that's thrown around a lot around Passover time, is the liturgy of the Seder meal, and it guides that, and it has various elements. It has songs, it has stories. There are 4 questions: why is this night special? What happened on this night? And kids are meant to ask this, and the reply comes from the older generation, and it's meant to be this exchange, in part because some of the commandments center around this are the idea that you were meant to pass this on to your children. So it's meant to be very family oriented, very interactive in that way. They have symbols that are set apart, that are the partially dipped in salt water, for example, is meant to be the when you eat it, you have in your mouth, and the salt water is meant to bring back their memory to the Red Sea, crossing of the Red Sea. The haroset, which is an apple wine grape mixture that is kind of desserty, but it's kind of a mortary type thing. It's meant to remind them of the mortar they use. They have these symbols around their Seder plate that all draw upon the narrative of the Exodus. And they're meant to have, as a Jew, think back to how they experienced this. And again, there's so much work done around communal memory theory. And in my dissertation, I read a lot about communal memory theory. And these rituals are so significant to the reason why thousands of years later, these stories, the meaning of the stories are told within the Jewish tradition. And this is how Jewish identity is formed and passed down, so meaningful. There are 4, in addition to the 4 questions, there are 4 rounds of drinking wine. typically in a Seder meal, and that's why on the whatever tradition that allows the East Greek Church, or maybe they allow, I don't know which one it was, they allow the Eastern Orthodox Church allows for the consumption of wine on this night, is because of that usually in a Seder meal or in some sort of remembrance meal, bringing out wine, and so there's drinking. So chances are, at most Seder meals in modern day, in our times, there's a fair amount of drinking going on. They drop the wine into the water to kind of dilute, as a symbol. But if you do a proper Seder meal, by the end of it, you've had about 4 glasses of wine. And if they're full glasses of wine, then you've pretty much, knocked back almost a whole bottle. What's that? Well, and actually, if we really wanted to do if you really want to do a Seder meal, you're meant to lounge too. A lot of people will do them on very low tables because it's meant to lounge on tables. It's meant to be this like relaxed sort of embrace of a meal in that way. Matzah, there's a lot of God commands them to prepare and to eat matzah. And so that's a part of the cleaning out of there's a ritual in a Seder meal where the youngest has to go look for the matzah, and there's been matzah bread folded and hidden in cloth, and they have to go look for it and find it, and then everyone puts up their plates and cleans off all the crumbs and the bread, and the idea was that's the preparation for going. But the whole thing, Passover for Jews, is to remind them of who they are. Remind them of their identities, remind them of their story, and that, prior to Egypt, there was Jewish connections, but there was no body of people. And the promise that God made to Abraham that I'm going to give you a people occurred, ironically, under the slavery of Egypt. They grew strong and powerful, and they continued to grow strong. And so when they left, they were a body of people. Now, from a practical measure, you think, well, maybe that happened because if it was just a couple hundred of them, they wouldn't have survived when they went into all the wars. They needed to be a mass of people. They needed to be a volume of people. They needed to be established as a people. So part of what happens in a Seder meal for Jews is to identify, this is who we are, this is our story, this is the defining characteristic, and who is God in this. God is the one who is faithful. God who was the one present through all of this. God is the one who split the sea. God is the one who gave them water. And it brings them through this whole journey of being rescued and liberated from Egypt. Okay, so that's Old Testament and in the Seder. Any questions about that? Thoughts? Anyone? Okay. The passages around the New Testament, there are, other than John 13, you have, as we talked about, that you love one another. The whole passage is John 13, really 1 through 17, and then a mandate kind of gives you some of the events of that night. Matthew 20, and I don't know how time is it. Matthew, let's read Matthew, well, I'll give them to you. Matthew 26, 17 through 29, for those who might want to write down the passages. Mark 14, 12, 25. Luke 22, 7 through 38. And then John, I guess I think that was the third lesson. And then the words are also found in Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians 11, 23, 25. And so typically when I'm presiding over communion, the passage that I would say I draw upon, I usually take some bits and pieces sometimes, and it doesn't not exactly the same every single time. But the words of institution, the words that are life before Jesus rested, after he didn't think, he broke bread. Those are words that come from the Corinthian passage of Paul's helping establish that as a part of the church. And I will say, just as an aside, and maybe not something to go deeply into, but regardless of how you understand what Christ was saying, and you have a vast interpretation going from Roman Catholics that believe in, again, transubstantiation. We talked about that before, that in the actual words of institution, that those elements become the literal body and blood of Christ. And so sometimes we think, oh, well, how could they believe that? Well, regardless of how they believe that, if you believe that, that's why the host has to be consumed and the blood has to be returned to the earth, because it becomes sacred, it becomes holy. It's part of the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic. Lutherans, Anglicans believe in something called consubstantiation, which is a spiritual, a real physical presence, spiritual presence in the physical host, which is why Lutherans and Episcopalians will also consume the host and return the wine to, some will drink it, look at all that nasty floaties. Some people will chug that stuff, in good faith. Not me. That's not my style. After communion, if you go out that side door of the church, you'll see a little purple stain in the snow. We as Presbyterians and those who believe in a real spiritual presence, but not a physical change. We believe actually the presence of God is not necessarily in the elements themselves, but in the participation. And then beyond that, there's a commemoration or commemorative or symbolic, and that usually happens in Baptist and when we really just meant physical. But regardless how you conceptualize it, the thing that Jesus was doing was establishing that this meal, that this practice is the sign of the new covenant, and that's why it's critically important for us. The sign of the new covenant, meaning that the when we participate in that, that we believe that God meets us as individuals, God, that we have the knowledge within us. No longer do we have to turn to our brother and sister and say, "No, God," because we each know God ourselves. And then the cup of that, I mean, really, the words are, this cup is the new covenant. And the cup itself obviously isn't the new covenant, but the same way circumcision was the covenant for, for us as Presbyterians or from the Reformed circle, baptism becomes the tandem for circumcision. In the same way, all Jewish families were brought into the covenant by having their males circumcised after the 8th day. The reason Presbyterians, in particular, celebrate infant baptism is that circumcision was a sign of the old covenant and initiation into it. So for us, baptism is an infant, it's a sign of the new covenant. But instead of just being for the male and falling through patriarchy, now it is for everyone, regardless of age, regardless of sex, regardless of everything. That all are welcome. It's a great equalizer. But in that instance of God celebrating, of Jesus instituting this new practice, this is probably baptism and the Eucharist sort of thing that bind us together as Christians across all time, and would be notably one of the places of deviation where we would sort of say they have changed these rituals, these sacraments. Which is why in the Presbyterian Church we don't do baptisms. We have a very strong communal theology or covenantal theology, and everything is done. So we won't do Eucharist, we won't celebrate the Eucharist or baptism outside of the community. The idea is not that you go to your home and celebrate with your family. The idea is not that you go home and celebrate with your family, but that everyone in the body that gathers together within the body would have to have together, because it's a covenant with God, representing that new covenant, but it is also a covenantal commitment that we exist as. Let's go ahead and read one. Maybe we'll go back to the Luke one is a little long, but why don't we read Matthew and Mark? Does anyone have Matthew 26, 17 through 29? Anyone Matthew? Anyone? Okay. You got to be a loud reader though, so people online can hear you. You want to read? No, yeah. 26, Matthew 26, 17 through 29. Nice and loud.
Matthew 26, 17. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to prepare the Passover meal for you?" As you go into the city, he told them, "You will see a certain man. Tell him, the teacher says, my time has come, and I will eat the Passover meal with my disciples at your house." So the disciples did as Jesus told them, and prepared the Passover meal there. Jesus sat down at the table with the 12. While they were eating, he said, I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me. Greatly distressed, each one asked in turn, Am I the one, Lord? He replied, One of you who has just eaten from this bowl with me will betray me. For the Son of Man must die, as the scriptures declared long ago. But how terrible it would be for the one who betrays him. It would be far better for that man if he had never been with him. Judas, the one who would betray him, also asked, Rabbi, am I the one? And Jesus told him, You have said it. As they were eating, Jesus took some bread and blessed it. Then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, Take this and eat it, for this is my body. And he took the cup of wine and gave thanks to God for it. He gave it to them and said, Each of you drink from it, for this is my blood, which confirms the covenant between God and his people. It was poured out as a sacrifice to forgive the sins of men.
So is that 29?
No,
Oh, one more, sorry.
mark my words, I will not take any down until the day I think it new with you in my Father's kingdom.
Which also says that Jesus wasn't partaking of the cup in his resurrected body, and that there will be wine in the new heaven and the new earth. So you have a sequence of events. It captures both of those. It captures the room. It captures the last time he's going to celebrate this ritual. It sort of foreshadows what's about to come. It has concrete words around the words of institution or the what's happening there. And then now let's go to Mark. Does anyone else have Mark? Does anyone online have Mark? Do you want to read? No one? Did you want to read? Mark 14. 12 through 25. Anyone online?
I'll get it.
It's
Mark
Like Glenda's plan.
14, 12 through 29.
Mark 14, 12 through 25.
Oh, okay. It was the first day of the festival of thin bread, and the Passover lambs were being killed. Jesus' disciples asked him, Where do you want us to prepare the Passover meal? Jesus said to two of the disciples, Go into the city where you will meet a man carrying a jar of water. Follow him. And when he goes into a house, say to the owner, Our teacher wants to know if you have a room where he can eat the Passover meal with his disciples. The owner will take you upstairs and show you a large room furnished and ready for you to use. Prepare the meal there. The two disciples went into the city and found everything just as Jesus had told them, so they prepared the Passover meal. While Jesus and the 12 disciples were eating together that evening, he said, The one who will betray me is now eating with me. This made the disciples sad, and one after another they said to Jesus, You surely don't mean me. He answered, It is one of you 12 men who is eating from this dish with me. The Son of Man will die just as the scriptures say, but it is going to be terrible for the one who betrays me. That man would be better off if he had never been born. During the meal, Jesus took some bread in his hands. He blessed the bread and broke it, and then he gave it to his disciples and said, Take this, it is my body. Jesus picked up a cup of wine and gave thanks to God and gave it to his disciples, and they all drank some. Then he said to them, This is my blood which is poured out for many people. And with it, God makes his agreement. From now on, I will not drink any wine until I drink new wine in God's kingdom. I think that's it, right? Through 25.
Does anyone hear anything different in there? No? It's one of the accounts again. I don't have it in front of me, but I broke it down and how they don't all follow. The passage in Luke, thank you, Glenda. The passage in Luke begins in verse 7. You have the agreement that Judas agrees to betray Jesus. And there's part of that, and then it says, Satan entered Judas and told Iscariot, one of the 12, and Judas went to the chief priests and officers. That's where we get the Spy Wednesday. And then in verse 7 of 22, it says they came to the day of unleavened bread. And again, I like what version was that? Your version that just said thin bread, Glenda? I like it.
Yes. Yeah.
So matzah, unleavened bread in which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John saying, "Go ahead," and they make preparations. As you enter city, you have the jar of water piece again. They prepare for the Passover. In 14, when the hour came, Jesus as apostles reclined at the table. That's where you get in the Seder meal, this idea that they're reclining, they're relaxing. And he said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." Again, he's pointing to these things, but they're not getting what's about to happen. For I tell you, though, you will not eat of it until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. And after taking the cup, he said, "Take this and divide it among you. I tell you, God's kingdom of God comes." Then he takes bread and gives thanks and breaks it, saying, "This is my body." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This is the cup of the new covenant. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. The hand of him who is going to betray me is mine on this table." So there you have a passage in Luke of being during that time. The Son of Man will go as it is decreed, but woe is the man who betrays me. They start questioning themselves. Dispute broke out among them that who is considered the greatest. And this is where Luke kind of differs. We get the whole argument of who is the greatest in the kingdom of God. Jesus agrees, or Jesus says, the kingdom of Gentiles, kings of Gentiles lord over them, and those who exercise authority over call them the benefactors. Who is greater serves. Then they get 31. Talks to Simon, and so you get in Luke a little bit more detail, and it's a much longer passage. And then he tells, and then at the meal, he talks to Peter in 31, which says, "Lord, I'm ready to go with you in the prison of death. And Peter, I'll tell you before the rooster crows today, you deny me that you know me 3 times." And so there's a lot more in the Luke passage that comes into play of Jesus' teaching. There's the greatest. There's acknowledging that Peter will deny Jesus after that night. And then he goes into verse 36. He says in 35, when did I send you without a purse, bag, or sandals? Did you lack anything? Nothing. He said to them, "But now, if you have a purse, take it, also a bag, and if you don't have a sword, throw your cloak and buy one," which is also and it is written, "It was numbered by his transgressions. I tell you this, it must be fulfilled in me what is written." And the disciples say, "See, Lord, here are 2 swords," and that's enough. So there is this sense of, before he said you don't need to go out and take nothing, but he's giving them about to happen, foreshadowing. And then he goes to Jesus is on the Mount of Olives. And then he says, "Willing to take his cup from me." And then so there's all of this. And so Luke presents this little bit different timeline. All of a sudden, Jesus comes out in the garden. And then he says, "Why are you sleeping? And get up and pray so that you won't fall into temptation." So Luke is the more historic account one. So by the time Luke was written, clearly these were stories that were being circulated about what happened on them. Mark, an earlier version. Matthew, maybe a version that was written, but you read Matthew's in the context of the written.
Jason, I have a question. In Luke there where it says, "If you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and get one." What was he trying to do? Is he telling them to take up a sword and go to battle?
No, well, this is the irony, because then they go out and Peter pulls out his sword, and Jesus said, "This will not be happening by the sword." I think the sword was this is a weird tension point for me, because most of what Jesus says in the gospel is like, you don't need provisions, you don't worry about your body, deny yourself. This is think of others better than yourself. My spirit is with you. You know, go out and you'll be provided for. And then in this passage, it's almost as if he's saying you're going to be persecuted. And there are deeper studies done on the notion of violence in the kingdom of God around, and these are the type of passages that support. And it could be reference to the fact that they will need defense because they'll be persecuted, and you know, and in times having a sword is not something that would be unthinkable. You know, people walk around. I don't want to draw and say the equivalent is a gun today, but the sense of protection. But it's been drawn in many conversations that this is a passage that testifies the reason you're not defensive. You know, so you can go from the pacifist end of the spectrum where we just let people completely abuse us, no matter what happens under all circumstances. We will not be non-violent to the point that we got to protect ourselves. You look like you're say something. No, okay.
We're losing the sound or something.
Yeah, I'm having trouble hearing.
Me too.
Because the sounds come. Start over again and just say nice and loud.
Well, apparently, I always thought it was a rooster, cock-a-doodle-doo. It could have been, but they said that there was the Romans had a
Mhm.
that went off every, so often, and that it could have been that he would have denied him 3 times before that Roman signal that went off every morning, which it was called a cock something.
Yeah.
And so before the, whatever. So I just,
Yeah.
it's neither here nor there. I just
No.
thought it was interesting because I always thought it was,
Natural.
it could have been,
It could have been something else. Yeah.
and we being military or whatever, every morning reveille would go off when we lived on post. So it just kind of was like, yeah, I could see how, that was something that happened every day at the same time.
I've never heard that before. But that's
I'll try to find
Yeah.
it. I was looking for it just then, but that was
Well,
interesting.
now I wonder too, when they were in the garden of Gethsemane, and Peter cut off the ear of that guy.
Yeah.
Does that have anything to do with him saying about
Peter's
having a
sword?
sword?
No, and
Because
that's
he was rebuked for doing
yes,
so.
and that's the paradoxical nature. But I think the intent was the mention of sword was about you're going into treacherous waters. And there's also suspicion about by the time it was written, you would have already had persecution happening for early Christians. And so again, the context that it was written in always affects the time that books are written in are representative of the way. I need like a lazy Susan here. Poor Susan, this woman named Susan who was lazy and just turned in circles, got that and Peter. that and Peter, petered out. And then the name Jim, that's just that's interesting, Teresa. I'll have to look that up. I've never heard that before. But I always like those sort of things. That's what makes the color into it. Sometimes we think, but you always have to take the writing from when it was written. And this is why John, some of these events, the sequence of events aren't something I really hold on to very strongly in John. The theology that's involved. The sequence of events contradict a lot of things in various points. They're meant to be more historical documents. In the basis sense, under the Jews have run speaking of John, and just noting the time, but John starts in John 13, and it starts the same way before the feast of the Passover. Jesus, knowing his hour had come, that he would depart from the world, having loved his own in the world. He loved them to the end. During the supper, the devil having already put in Judas Iscariot, the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon to betray him. He goes on, and then it goes into verse 5. He poured water into the basin and began washing his disciples' feet. And this is where we get the Maundy Thursday ritual of washing feet. And And this is where some of the, I don't want to say confusion, this is where some of the conflation of the mandate, the new mandate of loving one another, perfectly exemplified in the washing. And so he poured water into the basin, and after he began washing the disciples' feet and wiping them with a towel which he had tied around himself, Simon Peter, and he said to him, Lord, you're washing my feet? And Jesus answered him, what I'm doing, you do not realize right now, but you will understand later. You said,
Oh,
you said? And Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no place with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head. And Jesus said to him, he who has bathed needs only to wash his feet, meaning he who is at the rituals to cleanse him and going in the temple doesn't need their feet are still dirty, but everything else is clean. You are clean, but not all of you. For remove the one who is trying and after he washed their feet and taken their garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, you know what I've done? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are correct, so I am. If I, the Lord and teacher, wash your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. And you an example, you also do lay a state, slave is not greater than his master, and that's pretty strong language for that time. Or is one who is greater, is one sent greater than the one who sent him. And that's about the equity of God, that Jesus, the Son of God, and God the Father. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. Again, there's the mandate in some sense that you know you. This is why some people will say washing the feet is sacramental, not a sacrament. Meaning you speak, saying you're blessed if you do them. I am not speaking about all of you, the ones whom I have chosen, but this is happening so that you eat my bread is lifted up his heel against me. Again, another indication that Jesus did receive that before he left. Now, what I'm telling you before it happens, so it does, truly, you may believe that I am. Truly, I say unto you, the one who receives anyone I send receives me, and the one who receives me receives them. These are words that he's like. This is like his last chance. He's sending them out. He knows that, that they're going to feel the sense of abandonment. But each of these gospel accounts presents a little bit different, but they all present something different. And again, that's why in our meal of remembrance, what I did was look at it, try to put a flow or a sequence for which I begin. Just a few notes about the foot washing. Not only there it comes from is in John, the mandate you find later in that passage, in passage 34 of John 13. In the first century church, meaning and still not even a century after Jesus died, it was noted in writings that women would go to beggars to wash their feet. That's not a sacramental. In the early church, it was traditionally done before the Eucharist on this holy day. Before you received the supper, you would had your feet washed. From Cyprian in the 2nd century to Origen in Christendom or Circum and Augustine, all the way up to the 4th century, 5th century, it was considered something important. Cyprian said it's how we know what it means to have our hands in service, is to wash one's feet. All the way to Augustine saying it was an invitation. In Saint Benedict time in the 6th century, as his communities developed, it became considered foot washing of others was in addition to the communal foot washing that participated outside the communities. You have the spread of Benedictine spirituality in the 7th and 8th centuries, the practice recognized, and all the way up through, really, I mean, it's maintained with us through even the Restorationist movement, 1700s, where you see Mormons come out of, you see Pentecostal and Holy Students come out of. There was a rejuvenation of the practice of almost in the sacrament. There are 2 other references to foot washing Well, one, the idea of washing others' feet is actually a very biblical concept in Genesis, all over 18:4, 19, 24, 33, 43, 24, but they're all references to the washing of the feet in hospitality. It was meant to be like this as a sign. You have one more sandals. You have dusty for the feet, and you bring all that dust in. So you put that sandals, you wash the feet, and feet are walking around in a sense of sort of welcome to hospitality. But then in First Samuel 25:41 is the first time in scriptures we have that notion of and then all the way leading up to, it really is mentioned a lot after that. You have it obviously in the Gospel of John, but in First Timothy 5:11, we directly associate. And this brings us to the controversy of all of foot washing. Is an act of humility, is it submission to the other in terms of evaluation of humanity, or is it an act of hospitality? I think Christ takes all of those and wraps it up into the idea. It's not about me washing your feet and saying, "Oh, no one's better than anyone else. I'm going to wash your feet." It's about serving someone another in a very practical way. That saying, "This isn't beneath me. It's something that's displayed because it's in servants." Really would. You go around when guests come in. And so I think there's that side of that. That doesn't necessarily have to be done in this submissive way, but almost and I think that more of an equitable way, really serve one another. I said to someone the other day, I don't think any ideology that we have, I don't think any concept that we have that won't be society that doesn't exist in an ideological framework will ever come to full fruition on all of it. It's always going to be broken. And so we could say if everyone loved one another, everyone served one another, everyone put everyone else before themselves. That's true. Everyone in the world put everyone else before themselves and was always serving one another. Would be constantly giving. It'd be perfect. But then if one person's like, "Yeah, I like this giving, and I'm just going to receive it," and someone's like, "Oh, me too," and then we have. Because we're always self-preserving. This is the very nature of the gospel. This is the foot washing. This goddess of the word. It doesn't make a difference who you are. It doesn't make a difference what you know, or how much education you have, how much money you have, or how good you are, how fast runner you are. All of these things are going to be points in life service to be and that's what Christ does. The question becomes is this sacrament, as it is for some churches, or the sacrament? My 2 cents on it is I really don't care for foot washings, not because I have a problem with them. I've done them, I've led them, I've orchestrated them, I've participated in them. I find, and I said this last year in our second meeting, I find the act of washing works well in some groups, better than others. In Presbyterian circles, where you have a lot of people who tend to be more of a professional group, nature of the Presbyterian church as a whole, the idea of taking off your feet and sticking it out becomes almost this act of humility, even allowing someone to do it, let alone the one doing it. And sometimes I think we caught up in the practice of washing around all sense of humility, an act of humility. We do this, but then we go out to the parking lot and it's kind of one of those things that doesn't really meant to be an ultimate act, but it's so out of the context in which we live in that it's not really effective. It's sacramental in the sense that it remembers what Jesus did, but it doesn't actually bring us into a place of that same sense of servitude that Christ was calling. Any thoughts online? I'll throw out there. No. Okay. Well, in the last few minutes, for those of you who are going to be here, and I hope you can, if you're able to, we will be doing on Maundy, Thursday, a meeting with remembrance. And honestly, like the short history of my journey with it, as I said, I've participated in Saving Meals. I have led them from liturgy that I took from books with my family, ministries, I've looked at churches, over 100 people who had come to their Saving Meals. And I've written my own liturgy around it that kind of curtailed it. And one of the things that I did originally was one of the arguments around whether or not to celebrate cultural and religious appropriation. That is a meal that they remember, of Jews, about an event that happened to them as a people. Now we would say we were grafted into this covenant people, so therefore it becomes part of our history. But to take that ritual that they do and to do it exactly the same, there are a lot of people who say it's cultural or not wanting to do that. I nuanced the liturgies and the nuanced structures in times past when I led to acknowledge that by changing the verbiage to they and them around Israelites versus us. So in other words, rather than embodying the role of the Jew, it acknowledged that they went through that and we received our identity through what they went through, as opposed to we went through this. We didn't. That's not part of our culture. That's not part of our identity. It's a part of our story as Christians and how we find salvation, but it's not entirely ours. So I've wrestled with that for years, although I would say for the better part of 2 decades, I've celebrated in some form a ritual around the Maundy home. And this past year, the year before that, there was a kerfuffle. Town west leads a sort of Jewish oriented Christian, west tied to Jewish traditions. There was a home one being done by folks from Grace Dash. And I think I don't think there's anything wrong with any of the expressions, but for me personally, having gone through this journey of saying, how do we actually honor the tradition of what it is and not take it or not appropriate it purposes. And last year was the first year I dug into it. I just said, I'm going to sit down, I looked at the passage and worked it. And obviously I like to say stuff and that's kind of part of my journey. So what we have, and if you've never been to it, you are going to be able to do, is a meal that basically walks through the movement of the day of the Last Supper. We're welcome. There's a prayer of thanksgiving, preparation, and a verse that highlights the preparation. With the verses that read out loud to keep the Jesus that go off with the prayer, and read some appetizers. So it's kind of like there's a meal in each verse. The same way I say there is a meal in each verse. Liturgy. This is what we're doing. So there's a preparation, and we read the passage. There's the arrival. We have we have some salad and beforehand, and then we read the passage from Luke 22. Then arriving to the upper room. Prayer of invitation for those who come in to invite them to what's happening there, and highlights the invitation. That's where we run out some bread and rolls. We drink wine and sparkling juice, and then there is the prayer of communion, which is words. I do the words of invitation. We share in communion together, and then that's sort of the more liturgical part, the center of the mandate that has been given. And then we go into the meal fellowship. After the meal, we use that called Maundy about washing. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, out of silence, and then betrayal. And there are verses, and so there's verses all floating through this, and there's the prayer of departure as they go. But the idea of what we are doing on Maundy Thursday is we're walking through the events as Scripture has it tonight and creating a sacred meal around it, the one that doesn't appropriate Jewish tradition, the one that remembers what happened on that. So that's we're trying it again this year. I'm going to tweak a few things, but overall it'll probably follow a similar format. I just want to make sure everyone's aware of what's happening that night. So this Sunday, we'll open up registration for it. There's no cost to it. Just come as you are, and an hour and a half, 2 hours. And it's holy and sacred, and the amount of people who come to me said, "Are you going to do it this year?" makes me excited for that night. It's an expectation. All right, any thoughts, questions before we close? All right, and let's close in prayer. God of our redemption, we thank you for the week and holy days that are coming up. And as we prepare for them, not only through teachings like this, Lord, thoughtful reflection upon what will happen that week, but also you would prepare us for holy week, prepare us to gather as a larger body of Christians in Lake City as we gather for Palm Sunday, that we might move into that holy week with reverence, remembering and sense of growth. Pray in your Son's name. All right, y'all.
All right.
Bye.
This week we'll do.
Thank you.
And then an extra reminder, next week, for those of you who are here, will only be online because I will be in Austin. So I'll be doing that one online for everyone. So, all right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.